Literature Guide Continued. Theaters of War. Page 11. Although World War II was as close to a global war as any war had ever come in human history, it had its geographical foci, or main theaters of war. A major theater of war was, of course, the European continent. This is where the war began. All through the 1930s, Germany had pushed for rearmament, forbidden under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, negotiated at the end of World War I. Not only did Germany stop the reparations payments in 1931, which had contributed to Germany's radicalization while hampering the country's full-fledged reconstruction, but Germany also began, at first stealthily, and then increasingly visibly, to build up its armed forces and expand its military infrastructure, especially after the Nazi Party came to power in 1933. Nazi Party came to power in 1933. The rest of the history is well known. Hitler kept asking for ever more and more concessions from the nations to which Germany had ceded territory after the conclusion of World War I. First, he reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, a portion of Germany taken under French control in 1923, after the Germans had ceased to pay reparations according to the schedule established in the Treaty of Versailles. Then Hitler annexed Austria in 1938. In September of 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and other appeasers, that's in quotes, appeasers, agreed in Munich to Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland, a portion of Czechoslovakia predominantly inhabited by ethnic Germans. In the spring of 1939, Hitler broke his promise not to seek further territorial gains by demanding that Poland's port city of Danzig be returned to Germany. Then, on September 1, 1939, the Nazis staged a series of supposed Polish attacks against German installations at the border with Poland, and in reprisal, in quotes, Germany attacked Poland, unleashing a vast land and air campaign, thus starting World War II. Many nations bordering on Germany hastened to declare their neutrality in the conflict, and even countries as far afield as Chile were protesting their neutrality, hoping thereby not to be drawn into the vortex of yet another supranational war. Among the major powers, only France and Britain submitted declarations of war and mobilized their armed forces in response to Hitler's attack on Poland. One of the great diplomatic coups that had facilitated the German invasion of its eastern neighbors was the infamous Hitler-Stalin Pact of summer 1939, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the ministers who negotiated it. Until then, Nazi fascism and Stalinist communism had appeared to be the opposite ends of an ideological spectrum, and it was presumed that the two nations' leaders had nothing but contempt for one another. However, the world now learned with dismay, bordering on horrified foreboding, that the German and Soviet governments had set ideological differences aside to negotiate a strategic pact not to attack each other nor to come to the aid of other nations. In this way, Germany could avoid the domino effect of triggering bilateral defense agreements like those that had started World War I, with nation after nation being drawn into the war because another nation, with which it had protective agreement, had been attacked. The world would have been even more horrified had it known of a secret addendum to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, a protocol stipulating that the two powers had agreed to conquer and divide Poland between the two of them. Without having to worry about Russian intervention, Germany's superior military forces could sweep into Poland and claim the western half of the country, leaving the eastern half to Stalin, at least for the time being. Indeed, it had probably been Hitler's intention all along to violate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact further down the road. For as soon as he had sufficient military resources, after having concluded his blitzkrieg against France and Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Norway, he threw his forces against Russia, violating the Hitler-Stalin Pact and beginning his quest to conquer the Soviet Union in June 1941, a decision that more than anything else started the undoing of Hitler's drive for world dominance. It soon became clear that this war would not be restricted to Europe. Other theaters of war sprung up in the months and years that followed. With the entry of Japan into the war on the side of the Axis powers in 1941, the next great theater of war was the Asian Southeast, Indochina, as the Japanese occupied in quick succession the Philippines, Guam, Malaysia, Burma, and others. Their attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 opened the Pacific theater of war, which proved to be another case of overreach as the Japanese ultimately could not defend their positions in all of Indochina and the North Pacific. Meanwhile, the Allied forces, including the British, the United States, and Chinese militaries, were intensifying their operations against Japan. Another major theater of war was North Africa. As early as December 1940, German forces had entered North Africa to support the bedraggled Italian forces who had already waged war in Libya and Egypt earlier that year, but had been put on the defensive by armies of the British Commonwealth. In order to prevent complete Allied victory in North America, Hitler decided to dispatch Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and a considerable number of tank divisions to join the battle. The North African campaign was fought in Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and ended in 1943 with the Allied victory over Rommel's forces at the Second Battle of Al Alamein. Another troubling development for Germany was the weakening of Italy, with Italy's surrender to the Allies in September 1943 dealing a blow to Hitler's plans of establishing a German-dominated fascist Europe. Meanwhile, German expansion was halted on the Eastern Front, with the Germans losing decisively at Stalingrad in February 1943. Thereafter, the Germans retreated from Russia as the Red Army rolled back all the gains that the Germans had made in the previous couple of years. The beginning of the end of Nazi Germany's grand plans for world domination came on June 6, 1944, with the Allied landing in Normandy and the beginning of the reconquest of France. From then on, the Allied advance was unstoppable until Nazi Germany was utterly defeated by combined British, American, French, and Russian forces in April of 1945. The country was divided into 4 zones of occupation. The war dragged on for another few months in the Pacific theater until the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August of 1945 brought about the unconditional surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945, and the end of World War II. Next up, women and war.